We're very honoured this morning to have our Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe, join us. We're being joined today not just in the full room here in Dublin by the regional offices of Ibec as well in Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Donegal and Brussels, so it's an international event in that regard. I'm going to be the MC for the morning. We will do all of this within an hour. The Minister will give his lecture. I'll come back up here and do some Q&A, and I have a couple of people who already indicated questions here. We'll also take some from the regions. Our media colleagues at the back, there will be a press conference afterwards, so we'll keep the questions just to the business audience that's here. And without further ado, I'm going to ask the Minister to give the lecture. You're very welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me here this morning in Ibec. And if I could begin by marking a bicentenary that is coming up. And we are, of course, approaching the bicentenary of the birth of Karl Marx. Now, I know this is a milestone that probably is not marked very festively here. And I'm not sure quite what we may be having a discussion here this morning that at least in one way is going to be seminal, in that a Fine Gael minister is going to open up an address to here in Ibec by quoting Karl Marx. But there was a particular observation that he made from the Communist Manifesto of 1848 that does feel relevant to some of the discussion that we'll be having here this morning, when he famously in that text wrote about another phenomena and said that all that is solid melts into air. And while we are not experiencing the melting of investment and trade, we are seeing a change happening, even if that change is to something that's perhaps a little less solid, but no less real than all of the investment that we know well. And I want to talk to you here this morning about that change in an Ireland that, compared to even just 20 years ago, has changed profoundly. And that's because new communities of new Irish people, they live, they work, and they thrive throughout our community. New technologies have and will transform the way we work, the way we rest, and yes, the way we play. And new companies, new in every sense of the word, are now trading and operating in Ireland. New in the sense that some companies, indeed some of your companies, long and more recently established are now new to Ireland, where we have seen international brands that have been located here now for many years and many decades, but new also in the sense that long-established companies now engage in new forms of investment. And finally, of course, and as importantly, new in the sense that many companies that did not even exist a few short years ago now exist today. So, for example, in the period between 2012 and 2016, we have seen now nearly 88,000 new companies registered in Ireland. And when last year's numbers become known, it's likely that that figure will rise above 100,000 companies since the depth of our economic crisis. And we have seen a modern economy that has added layers of investment and success at different points in our economic history. Our journey away from a closed economy was led by the export of goods. To this, we then added excellence in the trading of services across many different sectors of our economy. And the most recent layer of development has been the increasing importance of investment and trade in intangible assets. And of course, all of this, when you put this together, has allowed us to make another journey away from our historical status as an exporter of our own people. So what are these kinds of assets and how valuable are they in the global and in our Irish economy? So what do I mean by an intangible asset? The OECD defined this as something which is not a physical or a financial asset, which is capable of being owned or controlled for use in commercial activities, and whose use or transfer would be compensated in a transaction between third parties. So, to articulate this in language that we're more familiar with, we mean the branding, the product design, and the development of working systems and types of intellectual property that, while they are synonymous with the modern high-tech sector, they actually exist in industries far beyond that. For example, the kind of innovation that we're seeing in our food and drink sector being an excellent example of this. And the very, very recent Capitalism Without Capital by Jonathan Haskell and Stan Westlake adds greatly to our understanding of these assets. As well explaining what they are, the design and branding that I've referred to a moment ago, it also talks about the qualities of these assets and what they can bring to companies and economies that nurture them, while also posing some questions that I want to outline a response to here this morning. The authors focus on 4 qualities in their work, the 4 S's of scalability, of sunkenness, of spillovers, and of synergies. And all of these qualities make investment in intangible assets very different to investment in physical assets. And to put this in context for Ireland today, intangibles are now the largest component of headline investment in Ireland. In the first 3 quarters of last year, for example, almost 35% of modified investment, that is, total investment with some of the flows of globalization removed, was in intangible assets. And this is up from 9% in the year 2000. It's a very similar story in our nearest trading partner. A report published by the UK government in 2016 suggested that UK investment in intangible or knowledge assets has been greater than that for tangible assets since the early 2000s. In 2014, for example, it stood at £133 billion sterling as opposed to £121 billion in physical investment. So looking at it differently indeed from an industry rather than a country perspective, sectors like computer technology, entertainment, media, consumer products and services, or even healthcare have very large levels of intangible assets now on their balance sheets. And this move is very beneficial for those companies creating what the authors refer to as so-called frontier firms who know how to make the most of their investment. And that kind of investment is now an increasingly important dimension of the Irish economy. So with all this in mind, I want to pose and begin the process of answering 3 questions. The first one is, how do we properly capture and measure this new type of economic activity? Second, what are the broad political questions that this raises for us? And thirdly, having sought to answer the first 2 questions, or at least mapped out a path to answering them, I want to talk about how Ireland can continue to be secure and prosper in a new economy. So if I begin with measurement and interpretation, this is particularly challenging given that our economy is so deeply embedded in global supply chains. We remember, for example, the 26% growth rate recorded in a quarter in 2015 as a clear example of some of those questions. It was driven by movements within the multinational sector. But just because these movements are difficult to measure doesn't mean that the new economy is not real. And a key challenge we are now responding to is how we measure this kind of economic activity in the context of how integrated our economy is into a global world. So in response to these kinds of questions and the limitations that we can identify with gross domestic product, with gross national product figures, the Economic Statistics Review Group, which was established by the CSO in late 2016, outlined a framework for responding to this. And one of the key recommendations of that group was for the CSO to develop a new indicator of the size of our economy to set aside some of these effects. So in July, the CSO published for the first time an alternative measure of the size of the economy, the so-called modified gross national income, or as many of you will be familiar with, GNI star. So without getting too technical, at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning, GNI star excludes some concepts like depreciation, deals with some of the challenges of particularly mobile and global companies. And the level of GNI star is estimated in 2016 at being €189 billion. This compares to gross domestic product of €276 billion and gross national product of €227 billion. And all of this has very important implications. For example, if the new measure is used to scale our debt, the debt ratio was 106% in 2016. That's expressing our national income as a percentage of, or expressing our debt as a percentage of our national income. It can be then easily seen, however, that the debt to gross domestic product figure of around 73%, if we use that, could present a metric that looks overly benign. So just like other forms of capital, intellectual property itself generates income flows that in turn affects how we measure income within our economy. However, these forms of flows can move very, very quickly. So my two key points in relation to this question is, despite the complexity that we're referring to, we can measure it, and we began to measure it last year. However, crucially, as we move forward, if we're looking to evaluate how our economy is performing, we will need to continuously look at our economy through a set of different lenses at each point to get a clearer view of how the economy is performing at any given point. So we are making progress in terms of measurement. But if we're making progress in terms of measurement and understanding, we then have to look at how we can use that knowledge as a way of creating not only a better country and economy, but a better society. And the reason for this, and this leads into the second question that I want to begin answering this morning, is that not everybody will immediately benefit from technological progress and increased global integration and the transition that's now underway in front of our own eyes to an economy in which knowledge and these forms of assets are playing an increasingly important role. There will be, and there could be, people who will be benefiting from it and people who will be losing from it. So that leads then to the second question I want to pose, which is the need to recognise the political consequences of this and look at how we respond back. How do we build a consensus to underpin, to moderate, to allow more people to benefit from the kind of change that is underway? And with respect to that, I want to make 2 points in relation to taxation. One in relation to international taxation, and then one in relation to our own domestic tax code. In relation to international taxation, I have said in a number of occasions recently that I believe the OECD offers the best platform to deal with many of the questions that are posed by the transition that is underway. And the key principles for me in dealing with all of this is that we need to tax where value is created. We need to look at rules that are supported globally. And we have to refocus in on what a digital transaction actually is. And the third question, of course, is of increasing importance, because too often in the past we speak of digital economies or the digital economy as if it was something different or something external to the economy in which we now operate in. The idea could be there that the digital economy is a little silo or envelope. That's one part of the economy, but ignores the fact that we now actually live in a digitized economy overall, where digital transactions are a big part of every company's business, be it an American tech company, an Irish food producer, or a German car manufacturer. The future of these issues is important to all such companies and to all of us. And many of the issues that we're now grappling with are created by the disconnectedness of multiple systems all over the world. And this really matters politically, because to quote from another recent book, The Gross Delusion by David Pilling, he makes the point, and I'm quoting him, that there are many competing explanations of what has caused popular rage in countries that have, judged by conventional measures, never been richer. There is, though, a common thread. People do not see the reality of our lives reflected in the official picture painted principally by economists. And this lack of recognition could only fester, could only get even more challenging amidst talk of concepts like intangible qualities and assets. And this is why our systems, particularly of domestic taxation, have to be seen as being fair. And of course, Ireland is recognised as already having a highly progressive and a redistributive income transfer system when you combine where we are with taxation and combine the operation of our social welfare systems. The OECD recognised this in 2016, and this will not be changing during my tenure as Minister for Finance. Indeed, for example, in 2018, it's estimated that the top 1% of earners in Ireland, in receipt of 12% of total income, will pay over 25% of all income tax and USC. But the need for our economic and tax systems to be seen to be fair, this is only going to deepen further in the future. So with issues of measuring this new economy and ensuring that it's fair and equitable going to be a growing part of our political discourse, the next obvious question is, how can we make it continue to work for Ireland? How can we keep on winning in a changing world? Is there an economic Johnny Sexton dropkick? Or, instead, are there not multiple phases coordinated over a very long time period, over many decades, that we have participated in, made happen, and have to keep working at? And in my view, I think the latter analogy is the more accurate. And there are 5 policies that Ireland has focused in on in the past, and we have to renew our commitment to across the coming period. The first one is the need for us to focus in on the kind of public goods that will support this new economy. And it is essential that our economy continues to see investment and higher levels of investment in the public infrastructure that will prioritise the investment that is vital for this kind of economy, whether it be where we are in broadband, whether it be where we are in public transport, how we can invest in the kind of cities and communities that people want to live in and invest in, many of whom are mobile in response to the kind of change that we are seeing. but also to demonstrate to communities and to citizens that the benefits and proceeds of the kind of change I'm talking about are invested in tangible things that they can see happening. And the Taoiseach and I, to that end, will be publishing a national development plan that looks to rise to this challenge very, very soon. And these investments, which will total over €100 billion in the next 10 years, they will be transformative. It will look to support our economy and our society in a very ambitious manner in the history of what is still a young country. The second will be to foster the right policy and legal framework for intellectual property. And Ireland does have the right legal framework to manage these kind of flows, but we need to continue to look at how we are doing in this area. And for example, the Higher Education Authority has been looking at this kind of work in our universities, in our research institutes, and will shortly publish its analysis of policies in this area, looking at how we can strengthen best practice and manage, for example, the kind of questions and even conflicts that occasionally can rise in relation to the commercialisation of intellectual property. Because given that technology is constantly evolving, it's of paramount importance to ensure that we keep this under review and make sure we have the kind of policy framework that we need. The third one is in relation to our tax policies that I touched on a moment ago. Our new economy must continue to remain, and it is, an attractive location for this form of investment. And that is why our core offering is a competitive regime with a rock-solid commitment to the 12.5% corporate tax rate. And as I said in another forum recently, it won't be going up and it won't be going down. Certainty in the tax treatment of intellectual property is an important component of our competitive offering, and it's part of it, as are all the other dimensions that I've touched on. And this was a point that was considered in the public consultation that has just closed on Seamus Coffey's report on corporation tax that my department published late last year. The fourth policy is how we develop our human capital as well as our physical infrastructure. And the most important resource in the new economy that we're referring to is that kind of capital, which comes from our people. It's crucial that we continue to invest in human capital so that our workers have the skills and knowledge to succeed in this economy. The retraining and the upskilling that we know is only going to become more important as technological progress disrupts existing industries, in particular through automation. And for example, the recent decision that was made to increase the National Training Fund levy and reinvest that back in to institutes and universities all over the country is a very clear example of our commitment to make progress in this area. And then the final policy area will be to foster the development and the continued development of clusters in important growth areas to retain, to attract and to sustain investment. At the moment, such clusters exist in Ireland in many areas like technology, like pharmaceuticals, like the audiovisual sectors, as well as many others. And I'm sure you all know of our reputations in this area. And indeed, I know many of you work in such clusters. And the government, through our National Development Plan and through our National Planning Framework, will continue to nurture these vital communities, look at how we support them, and indeed how we can develop new ones. And through these ways, we can win. Pursuing these 5 key policies in relation to public goods, our policy framework, in relation to certainty in key policy areas, in human capital and in clusters, will allow Ireland to continue to succeed in this new economy and continue to allow our economy and our society to move up a changing value chain. But we do need a renewed national conversation on the new economy and how we make it fair and how we make it work for our country. And I hope this event here this morning and approaching events will be part of that dialogue. And I say all of this because I am an immensely optimistic person. I'm immensely optimistic for the future of our great and our little country. The years that lie ahead of us, notwithstanding the many difficulties and threats that do exist, can be good for us. They can be good because we have equipped our country to meet changes that have occurred and will occur in finance, in technology, and to stand at the centre of that change. And indeed, many of you here today are already proof of that. The question is no longer, has the economy changed? Because it has. The question is not, is the new economy real? Because it is. The question is, what are we going to do to sustain the new economy for Ireland in the future, for our society and for our economy? Are we going to, as a country, continue to enthusiastically embrace the value of ideas that can generate substantive economic activity, in turn to bring jobs, to create the wealth that allows for the transition from a recovering economy to a healed society to continue to accelerate after the last decade? Are we going to use this new economy to make Ireland a safer, a fairer, a cleaner and better place to live in? Or can we view change that is underway with a spirit of negativity, distrust or scepticism? Because I believe that small countries like Ireland that are agile, that are open, are particularly well placed for the challenges that lie ahead, because we're more able than others to respond back to the changes and developments that are around us now. Small really is beautiful. And while we are small, we need to think big. Many of you have heard it said that Ireland has, up to now, endured a lost decade of lost jobs, lost investment, and lost hope. And that is the reality of so many communities and citizens throughout our country. But the next 10 years needs to be about so much more than simply recovering loss. Going back to Mr. Haskell and Westlake's book, Capitalism Without Capital, they actually point out that small countries, like Singapore and Ireland, have taken the steps necessary through policy areas, through codes, in relation to the development of financial and intellectual clusters to lead the way in the fostering and the development of this new economy. So with that in mind, the next 10 years for Ireland will be about change and ambition to deliver a better standard of living, greater fairness, and a better life for those who are born here and those who choose to live here. And wanting those things for our people is nothing new. Thank you.
Mr. Donohoe, thank you so much. It was, I had the benefit of seeing the speech last night, and I think it actually gets even more impactful because it is a seminal moment in our economy and society. And indeed, it's, while intangibles are something that is modern phenomenon we are dealing with as a society and as a country, we have long traded on intangibles because goodwill is probably the most long-standing of that, and we will have challenges in where our goodwill starts to diminish in this world, as well as our success breeds envy and so on. So the combination of embracing the new while also being attuned to what has brought us to this point as well, I think will be important. So we have some time, but in the nature of making sure everybody gets in, I have a couple of people I want to identify, but probably preeminently, and I'll ask them to stand up, but our president, Ibec's current president and MD of Trilogy Technologies, Adele Creeley, has a question. So Adele.
Good morning, everyone. Minister, thank you so much for your speech here this morning. Very uplifting and encouraging. I particularly like talking about changing the conversation from a recovered economy to a healed economy, because that is very much what we are today. Ireland, Ibec has launched a campaign quite recently around the substance of the Irish business model. In fact, you will have seen some of the tangible representation of that model as you came in here today. And I think it very much lines up with the messaging of your lecture here today with us. So we see that as a very strong endorsement by government of how Ibec has been representing the substance of the Irish business model. And on that subject, I think it's very important that both nationally, economically, politically, as businesses, etc., it's really important that we have a very consistent message internationally to combat any of the misconceptions that there are out there around the substance of the Irish business model. So I would be interested to hear any further comments you may have on how we can ensure that we all work together to have a very united voice around sharing that message of this positive substance of our very, very healed economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2 points I'd offer back in relation to what you said there, Adele. It's number one, we have to make the case for the benefits of trade, the benefits of ideas as a source of economic success. We have to recognise that those ideas are now embedded in far many more parts of our economy than the very high-tech parts of our economy that we're very familiar with. That these ideas now have a value in them that are percolated throughout the entire weave of the Irish economy. And if Ireland and other smaller countries that have not allowed our physical size to operate a different form of scale, don't make that case now, then we should not expect others to make it for us. And I'm doing that here today, as I've done now since last December. The other thing, though, that I want to do here today is I do want to locate this within a broader societal and political context. And that is why I was making the point that a recovering economy is not the same thing, yes, as a society that is fully healed. And that journey is ongoing. It's a journey we are always on. And we have to recognise that because of the change in the economy that we are referring to, it becomes ever more important now to explain to people that I'm lucky enough to represent and be in their government. Explain what is happening, but explain then how we want to use the proceeds of that to invest back in what we need to do to change the nature of our society, and how we are committed to doing all of this in the most efficient and fairest way possible. We have to make that link, because I'm increasingly struck that if we don't make that link and call that out, then others either will, but call it in a different way, or the link won't be made at all. And I think the long-term consequences of that for an economy like our own could be very challenging. And I want to avoid that happening. So that's what we're calling out here today. And I'm very conscious that many of the companies that are here and many of the unions that are represented here are at the heart of that dialogue. And I think it's a dialogue that we have to participate in now, both as a country and internationally as well.
Gary McGann. Gary, would you stand there? Gary's chairman, RITSA, Paddy Power. Could go on.
Good morning, Minister, and thank you very much for a very inspiring speech. And indeed, while I'm on my feet, congratulations on your performance in Davos in very adversarial circumstances. I think the adage of keeping your friends close and your enemies even closer certainly comes to mind.
I think I'll have a glass of water.
Can I suggest to you, or indeed ask you, that in the context of the significant geopolitical problems the world is facing, the challenges fiscally to taxation worldwide, and our own domestic challenges around broadband, the availability of housing, places at second-level education, and arguably the unsustainable funding model for third-level and lifelong learning, would you agree that it's vital at this point in time for business and government departments, not just your own, which is commendable in terms of its engagement with business, but the many government departments that fundamentally impact and influence, either positively or negatively indeed, the economic development of the country, that it was never more important for that connection to be re-established and indeed further energised?
Thanks, Gary.
I think it's so important that with all the change that we have underway, that employers and employees and the representatives of both have as much engagement as possible with all elements of government, Gary. I have been tremendously struck by the quality of that engagement in relation to Brexit over the last 12 to 18 months, where it has been ongoing, very, very broad, and at times not always public. And organisations like Ibec, like those in the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, have played a really important role in talking publicly about the collective challenges that are coming up, and indeed dealing and representing those views with their peer organisations in the UK and elsewhere. And it has been part of a very cohesive and coherent effort that was very important in where we got to last December. And I know that all of my government colleagues want that kind of dialogue to happen. And in what I'm outlining here this morning, I'm making the point that there are a set of public goods that we're providing in some cases, but we are going to supply more of them in the future, that are going to be at the heart of how we can maintain inclusivity and a stable society in a changing world, while also delivering the imperative of economic success. And getting that balance right, and us collectively responding to some of the questions I talked about here today, I think are at the heart of the shared journey that we have ahead of us. But government clearly plays a critical and leadership role in that.
Just as I segue, I think I'd agree with you on the need for that social dialogue that's been experienced around Brexit, but also, to pick up on Gary's, the future of Europe debate is going to be as equally important, given what the nature of the lecture was this morning as well in this new world. And just to acknowledge, even today coming to this event, the wide breadth of society, including our colleagues in the Congress of Trade Unions. Aisling Keegan from Dell has a question. Aisling's also the chair of Technology Ireland as part of Ibec.
Thanks, Danny. Good morning, Minister, and thanks for the speech this morning. Very relevant and current. You described yourself as immensely optimistic, so we're kindred spirits, because I've been described as sickeningly optimistic. In that and as a result, that optimism, I'm of the opinion, similar to yourself, of change brings lots of opportunity, and I think the change that we're going through in terms of, that digital acceleration, the market in which we operate in, where we're located, the economy and everything else is rich in opportunity. However, change also does bring uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So, from the lens of the Chair of Technology Ireland, based on what you talked about in terms of digital transactions being part of every company, the increase in investment in the intangible assets and the growth in the 88,000 companies that have been created in the last 4 years, 2012, 2016, and the international dialogue on digital taxation, I'm keen to understand from your perspective what the government can do to provide certainty to business leaders across all the spectrum and international investors in Ireland.
Okay, so in relation to the certainty point that you're making there, I've said on a number of occasions that amidst the changing world that we are seeing at the moment, that certainty in a number of key policy areas can allow Ireland and our people to win in a way that is perhaps bigger than we even understand or expect at the moment. And in relation to the different ways in which we can deliver that certainty, I believe in the next week or so, you'll see us outline what we want to do in terms of the supply of public goods. And while, of course, it is understandable that we will then enter into a debate about is that supply sufficient? Are they being allocated in the right place? We're going to have that debate coming up. But what will be important for me is that we will be having that debate over a time frame of at least a decade. Because if we don't begin to engage now in capital decisions that are beyond what we want to do next year or the year afterwards, we're going to find ourselves in a place in a few years' time where we're going to be asking hard questions regarding why we don't have big things done. And my view, if I look back at where we are, is one of the reasons why we are now where we are with an investment point of view, is Ireland only for quite a short time period in our recent history had the right levels of capital formation going on. And then that took a big step back because of everything that we all know. So I think we'll provide certainty there. In relation to taxation, you've heard me outline in other fora and elsewhere my views in relation to the principles of corporate taxation. Digital taxation is going to be a big area of debate now across this year. And I'm outlining the principles upon which Ireland is supporting it. But from the OECD report, which will be out in April, to the European Commission proposals that will come out around that period, it's going to be a big area of negotiation and debate. You're right, it is going to bring much change. And it's because of all the experience I've had representing communities that are able to respond back to change, but also in seeing communities that have had to deal with very sudden and negative change, that I'm really committed to putting all of this out in a political context, because we have to be talking about issues of inclusivity in our society. We have to be talking about living standards now, in the same breath as trying to define what an intangible asset is. Because if we don't do both, we are going to, a bitter harvest will await. And I'm committed to making sure that harvest does not materialise.
Next question, we're going to go to Alistair Blair. You threw me with the marks at the start. I forgot to mention the hashtag Ibec lecture, if anybody is, as Karl Marx would say, hashtag Ibec lecture. Alistair Blair, MD of Expenditure here in Ireland, and one of those companies in the vanguard of the digital agenda.
Thank you, Danny. Minister, thank you very much for painting, I think, a very clear picture of something that is, to most people, a bit of a conundrum and very complex, so thank you for that. Whatever about being sickeningly optimistic, I wasn't very optimistic for about 8 minutes last Saturday afternoon, but there we go. So be it. Can I just ask you, I think the picture you painted of the importance of intangible assets is an extremely difficult thing to communicate to many people. And I think you brought it very clearly to light. It's at the heart of our business. I think it's at the heart of everything we're trying to do in Ireland as a country. But also the physical side of it is critically important to enable those skills and those assets. So could I just ask you maybe to expand a little bit on the 5 policy points, or expand a little bit on 3 points. One is, what could we do to expand or increase commercial investment? Secondly, maybe are there planning or other regulatory related items we need to kind of clear off the road ahead? And then maybe just very briefly, thirdly, on the broadband issue, and how do we accelerate that? Because that is the sort of arteries and lifeblood through which everything will flow.
So sorry, with broadband,
commercial investment, what can we do to increase commercial investment? Secondly, what can we do to perhaps remove some of the barriers around regulatory and planning issues? And thirdly, the broadband thing.
So in relation to broadband, you're all very familiar with where that process stands at the moment and the developments there of early this week. And myself and Minister Naughton remain absolutely committed the objective that is laid out in the National Broadband Plan. And we are working together in relation to that at the moment, because I know that it is as essential now a form of connectivity as where we are with things like roads and gas connections. And we are going to work to ensure that ambition is realised. In relation to planning, you'll have seen today the announcement from government in relation to how we are looking to further strengthen the planning process in relation to decisions that we believe are genuinely strategic for the country's fortunes. And in relation to commercial investment, I guess in some ways, Alistair, the second half of my speech is all about recognising that the answer to it has many, many different dimensions, and there's lots of different parts to it. That the challenge of intangible assets and ideas has two components to it. The physical end of things that I've outlined, that we're looking to make further progress on in the next couple of weeks, but also the concept of intangible infrastructure, particularly for small and open countries. And the intangible infrastructure, a big part of that is how we look after communities, national communities that are inclusive and have the assets within themselves to allow us to both generate these ideas and capture the economic benefits to them. And the more I think about that part of it, the more I think that what we're doing in higher and further education is an integral part of it. And, you know, I was very pleased that we had a lot of dialogue across the last number of months with employer and employee organisations, and we managed to reach an understanding in relation to the role of employers' PRSI and how we can use that to address some of the investment challenges that we have. And in our national plan, we're also going to be outlining further ambitions in relation to investment in higher and further education.
Now, one of the other features of this new world is sometimes called the disembodied economy, and so we're going to go to the regions. We mightn't physically see them, but Cormac McDonagh is in Galway, and Ingersoll Rand, or in the more substantive brand that we'd be used to, Thermo King, is in Galway at the moment. So see, this is technology work. Cormac, do you have a question?
Thanks, Danny. Good morning, Minister. And thanks to Ibec for making this happen. Pertinent to the discussion on broadband, even though a lot of our centres now have good road connectivity, it is a significant investment in time to travel to Dublin for a 1-hour meeting. So this is a very welcome initiative. So, yeah, Minister, just 3 issues very quickly. One of them, the Western Corridor, and by that we're talking about Cork to Derry, with an economic centre selected in the northwest, housing and planning delays, which you just touched on. So very briefly, we'd like to welcome the National Planning Framework. A plan that prioritises everything equally is not a strategic plan. So we need to select some key investments to address the future needs of the country. Clearly, the priorities that are selected will not benefit all sections of the economy directly, but if we pick the right ones, will affect everybody indirectly. So along the western seaboard, we very much welcome the M20 investment. Nevertheless, we agree with the Ibec executive that the Midlands and the Northwest region need strong focal points to champion their economic aspirations. We'd like to see the government prioritising in the NDP that you spoke of, a link from Cork to Derry to reduce transport costs along the route and to promote business within these urban centres. The second question is very straightforward. The investment is needed in housing nationally to avoid the squeeze on the industrial working population so that we can maintain international competitiveness. And the final issue relates to, as you mentioned, being small and agile. It's not one of your 5 priorities or key policy areas, but it is an enabler, and that's the area around planning. So we welcome the changes that you mentioned that were announced this morning to address the lengthy delays in planning approval for infrastructural investments. However, they appear to be very limited in their effect. We very much nurture the wealth of our environment in the regions. In fact, we see it as a means to attracting FDI and remote workers. Nevertheless, there seems to be an imbalance between the beliefs that are held by minority interests, especially when dealing with environmental concerns, and the needs of the majority population. And finally, on the same subject, it appears as if the longest delays in the planning process, for example, the Galway Outer Bypass and Galway Docks development proposals, just to give an example, are being caused by very lengthy queues trying to get court cases heard in upper courts. So unless we address these, these issues, we see the national investment strategies being delayed and watered down somewhat. Thank you.
Thanks, Cormac.
Wow, right. Let me, Cormac, very good. So let me begin by answering each of them in turn. In relation to, if I begin with housing, yes, I'm keenly aware of the further progress that we need to make in that. We have, through Rebuilding Ireland and the work of Owen Murphy, already outlined a really ambitious investment plan in that area, looking to deliver a further, for example, 50,000 homes for our fellow citizens that rely on the state to provide homes for them or to provide support for them to be in homes. In addition to that, we need to see the private sector respond back to the rest of the needs that are there for additional homes at affordable pricing. And my continued analysis is that where we are with the use of land, the release of land and the pricing of land is at the heart of that. And that is why in the last budget I made decisions in relation to the taxation of commercial property. I made decisions in relation to the length of time in which withholding taxes would apply in relation to land. And I made a decision in relation to the vacant site levy to address matters in relation to the supply of land for housing. And we will have more to say on that in the next couple of weeks in terms of how we make further progress on that. And Owen Murphy has talked about that matter. In relation to planning, Cormac, we do have a balance that we need to strike here between understandable and long-term concerns that citizens may have in relation to projects and the short or medium-term economic return of those projects. And the proposals that were outlined by government last night represent our view regarding what the right balance looks like for a certain number of particular forms of investment. In relation to judges, there's a topic I wasn't expecting to be addressing this morning. Of course, we have set up a new court, the Court of Appeal, to look at how we can take particular cases out of our existing court system to free up capacity to deal with the kind of issues that we are talking about here today. And then finally, in relation to the plan that we will be concluding on in the coming days, I'm well aware of the challenges and needs that the northwest of our country has in terms of creating a stronger all-Ireland economy to then allow us to respond back to the challenge of Brexit and to the challenge of economic growth being concentrated in particular cities and communities. But as always, Cormac, what I have to try and do is strike a balance between meeting key needs and actually being able to afford to meet them in the long run and not kicking off other things in our economy that could cause the kind of difficulties we had in the past. And we are working very, very hard to do it. And I believe we will come up with that balance.
That's a good segue to the final one, which is, I can also just in relativity, I can assure you that Cormac would come to Dublin to watch Galway in the All-Ireland for that hour, so just at least you feel too important.
No problem.
Sean Kearney is in our Donegal office, and Sean's the general manager of Solas Loch-esque Castle Hotel. And again, I think it's a good segue in what you talked about, the All-Ireland dimension, but also the aspects of the Northwest, which I know you have talked about previously. Sean, can you hear us and give us your question?
I can hear you, Danny. Thank you very much. And we'll be struggling to get down on Saturday evening for the Dublin game. But, Minister, thank you for being here today. And I appreciate the lecture on our new economy and the points raised on the intangible assets. But the sectors that are heavily reliant on tangible assets, and I understand that Ibec regionally has put through a very, very detailed response to the National Planning Framework and the retention of 9% VAT. But, for example, tourism, hospitality, food and beverage industry, infrastructure, transportation, education. I would like to hear what are the government's plans to ensure regional competitiveness for these sectors within this new economy.
Well, look, thank you, Sean, for your question. The first one is across the morning and in other events, and we'll be continuing with this work, we have outlined the forms of tangible investment that we believe are essential to support businesses such as your own. And the sequence in which I have analysed where we are with an all-island economy is strengthening an all-island economy and responding back to opportunities that we have in other parts of our countries is the right thing to do of itself, and is an essential dimension of what a more competitive and resilient national economy will look like. Of course, that then helps us deal with some of the issues that I know, your customers and staff and your communities are feeling at the moment in terms of what will be happening and what could happen in a post-Brexit Ireland. In relation to how we are looking to support the tangible businesses that you have talked about, there is much that we have done and will be doing soon in the National Capital Plan to respond back to that. I would contend the fact that we are moving to a point that we may later on in this year have more people working in our country than we've ever had before is a sign of the fact that we have great leaders such as yourselves doing the right things in our workplaces, supported by good policy decisions by this and the last government. And it's come together in this way. In relation to, and I have to admire the way you segued in the 9% VAT rate into a discussion on the intangible economy. Very important. There's a lot of supporters for that in this room here this morning. Look, we've made the decision in relation to that in Budget 2018, and that tax rate will have to await Budget 2019 for a decision about it for next year. And I think it's fair enough for me to say it, given that it's only the first week of February.
Paschal, thank you very much. Listen, I'm just very conscious of the time, so I might actually bring it to a close, but I just want to say a couple of things, really, just to say that this has been videoed and we'll do a podcast, because this is the start of, I think, a combination for us as a society and a generation. Too much is given, much is expected, and we are at the cusp of something very dramatic in our economy, as the Minister outlined this morning, and generative of quite a lot of opportunity and resources. But we need to use that effectively, and I think we're on the right track. Also, just a piece of huckstering, I suppose, the Ibec Business Leaders Conference on the 27th of March is on this theme, because one of the authors of the book, and this wasn't choreographed, it is now, Jonathan Haskell, or as we like to say, the Paschal Haskell thing. We are going to be fortunate to have that debate on not just the substance of the economy, but also now increasing the sustainability. And on that front, lights are going out.
I had nothing to do with that. In fact, I did. I pressed the button here.
Put another penny in the slot there. But, just to say again, genuinely, thank you for not alone coming to this morning, but also what is very evident, the leadership that you and your colleagues are giving this new Ireland as much as anything else, and particularly those really really significant issues and exciting issues for this generation, albeit around some difficulties with Brexit, but the all-island economy, the all-island positioning in the global world, I think we have what's required because Irish people do intangibles very well and have done for a long time in the absence of having tangibles. So on that front, I think we're very, very confident, and thank you.
Thanks, Danny.